Good evening and welcome to Skullnet 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and I am joined today by Martyn Dayl, the former SNP MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. Hello,
Hi.
good to have you here. For our first story, we've got the Ukraine update, day 875 of a conflict. Russia has been forced to lock down 14 border villages in its Belgorod region due to the Ukrainian fightback against Russian attacks on the Kharkiv region across the border. From July 23rd, we are restricting access to the 14 residential settlements where the operational situation is extremely difficult, said the Belgorod governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov. Sorry. Vladimir Putin launched a May ground offensive on the northeastern Kharkiv region, and he said was intended to create a buffer or sanitary zone to protect the Belgorod region, but it has instead come under continued shelling and drone attacks from Ukraine, with frequent fatalities, while Russian successes in the Kharkiv region have been limited. The chief of Russia's general staff, Valery Gerasimov, thanked Russian forces on Tuesday for capturing the village of Urozhain in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, Russia's defense ministry said. The European Council President, Charles Michel, has rebuked Viktor Orban for declaring that the EU had a pro-war stance in Ukraine. The rotating presidency of the European Union Council has no role in representing the Union of the international stage and received no European Council mandate to engage on behalf of the Union, Michel told the Hungarian PM in a letter. Hungary currently holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU, which represents the bloc's member countries. Orban's diplomatic freelancing with Russia, China, and Donald Trump has infuriated other EU member states, which intend to boycott meetings organized by Hungary during its 6-month presidential term. Orban has written to the European Council claiming that Donald Trump has detailed and well-founded plans to peace between Russia and Ukraine. Jennifer Rankin writes. Orban opposes EU assistance to Ukraine in defending itself in the face of overwhelming support from the EU as a whole. It is 10 years since civilian flight MH17 was shot down over Ukraine by a Russian anti-aircraft missile, killing all 298 passengers and crew on board the airliner. Ukraine's state company Ukroboron Service and the Czech gunmaker Sellier and Belot plan to build an ammunition factory in Ukraine. The latter's prime minister, Denis Shmyhal, said on Tuesday. The agreement was signed as Shmyhal visited Prague. Ukraine's parliament has voted to scrap taxes and duties on imports of energy equipment such as generators, solar panels, and power storage systems. Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities have left millions facing extended blackouts. Ukraine has lost about half of its available generation capacity. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have announced that they are cutting their Soviet legacy electrical grid ties with Russia and its ally Belarus. An ally International Monetary Fund team began talks with Ukrainian officials on Tuesday. The IMF has released $3 billion to Ukraine this year under a $15.6 billion program called the Extended Fund Facility. Now, Martyn Dayl, passing over to you. Tell me about what you see in this Ukraine conflict and what are the key points that you gather?
Well, I've said before, and I'll probably continue to say for God knows how long to come, it's just so thoroughly depressing, and it's hard to see any end in sight, which is the most depressing part of it altogether. There is, absolutely no doubt that we have to do everything we can to support Ukraine. It is the country being victimised by the much larger neighbour, and I think it's just appalling. I just don't see an easy solution to it.
Thank you, Martyn. Going on to our Israel and Gaza latest, where the Gaza Health Ministry have said that at least 38,794 people have been killed and 89,374 injured in Gaza since October 7th. The US and Israel have allowed tax-deductible donations of about $200,000 to free groups involved in preventing the delivery of humanitarian supplies to Gaza aid. At least 8 UN-run schools sheltering people in the Strip have been hit in the past 10 days. In 9 months of war, 70% of UNRWA facilities have been bombed and 539 people sheltering there killed. In the west of Gaza City, Israeli bombardment near a school in the Al-Rimal neighborhood killed at least 9 Palestinians, including 3 children. News agency Wafa is reporting that Israeli authorities have forced a Palestinian family to demolish their own home in Al Isawiya, north of occupied East Jerusalem. The Israeli municipality ruled the house must be destroyed because it was built without permits, which are notoriously difficult for Palestinians to obtain. Palestinian media is reporting the Israeli forces have released Palestinian journalist Imad Abu Awad from the Nafa desert prison in the Negev after 9 months of incarceration. Now, Martin, we're just about to get into our King's Speech coverage. And so I was wondering, with obviously a new Labour government in play, do you see the situation in Palestine changing at all?
I, I mean, we've just had the Ukraine update, which I dismissed as thoroughly depressing. On top of which, I think the whole Gaza Palestine situation, if you had any optimism left, well, this is a cure for it. It really, I just don't see anything improving, and it's just so thoroughly horrific what's happened there. And unfortunately, unless we have, an immediate ceasefire, an end to the arms trail with Israel, and restoration of UNRWA funding, and trying to get things back on a level keel, we're not going to see anything improve. It's just utterly depressing. And it's not just an event, which affects us morally, looking at it from a safe distance in the West. It will affect us as well in a whole range of ways, even things like the spread of antimicrobial resistance. That's something that happens in the result of war zones and the munition explosions. So we're going to see the effects here as well. It's not just something that's happening far away to somebody else. It's something we should all be deeply concerned about for a whole range of reasons. Unfortunately, I just don't see it necessarily improving any.
Thank you, Martin. And so, for the King's Speech, today marked the day of the King's Speech, a key tradition where the sitting government gets to write a script for the King to read out, setting a tone and goals for the coming parliamentary year. The speech represents an opportunity for the new Labour government to present the vision they have for the country. So, out of the 40 proposed bills, we'll take a look at those relevant here in Scotland, with insight from Martyn Dayl, of course. For economy and budget, there's the Budget Responsibility Bill, which sets out the large fiscal measures. That large fiscal measures must come with an assessment from the Office of Budget Responsibility. There's also the National Wealth Fund Bill, which establishes an advisory body for investors in the hopes of directing their funding and aiding it with taxpayer funds. The speech also outlined measures to help people get more out of their retirement pots and audit reform designed to put more scrutiny on corporations. Now, taking a look at just these sort of budget and economy measures, what do you make of a national wealth fund? Does it at all resemble what countries generally mean by a wealth fund as well?
Well, I think I need to see the detail first, and I haven't seen the detail. I've seen the headlines from the King's Speech, watching it from afar this time, and I suppose my first reaction is even just the general sort of media reaction. There's been more angst at somebody's mobile phone going off during the King's delivery of the speech than there has been about the absence of measures to tackle poverty.
Mm.
And I just think, once you get into that realm, there's something sadly wrong with our society or should I say, perhaps nothing wrong with our society. Perhaps it's the media that's serving our society that has a fault, and we need a much more independently minded media to be challenging these things. Let's get a grip here. A mobile phone going off, well, inconvenient, but trivial. The absence of poverty measures, the absence of the tackling the two-child cap, which is the big cause celeb at the moment, something my colleagues and I pushed for many years, and I think the work that Alison Thewlis did all the way from 2015 when it was introduced should be recognised. Let's just hope that enough of our new MPs, and most of the MPs are completely new in the UK, find a backbone and force through an amendment to it, because it's relatively small beer in the grand scheme of things, and it would lift hundreds of thousands of children straight out of poverty.
Thanks. For the environment, the Great British Energy Bill pledges £8.3 billion for investment into publicly owned energy, and the Sustainable Aviation Bill wants to increase lower emission aviation fuel production for UK plants. Now, obviously, Martyn Day, for this Great British Energy Bill, how much can the government really do with £8.3 billion, and where do you see this project going in the future?
I think it's one we have to watch. The reality is Scotland should have its own separate energy system. We should have our own separate Scottish grid, and we would all be benefiting from much cheaper energy. We have the energy, we just need the power. And I think any UK-wide energy bill will just be another way of stripping our assets off and not us seeing the benefit of it. Now, that might sound a bit selfish, but we're sitting through the midst of a cost of living crisis where people can't afford to heat and they can't afford to eat, and we should be able to do stuff to alleviate that in a first world country that is so affluent, relatively speaking, in terms of energy and food production. So I'm highly sceptical of what will be achieved by it. However, we need to be arguing for what we want, and not just falling into line with saying, well, anything they do is better than nothing. And if they're going to do something, let's make sure it happens in Scotland. Well, let's make sure we get the full benefit of it, is what I'm saying.
Hmm. Actually, on that note, you mentioned there the amount of like heavy lifting that you see that the Scottish government has to do. What did you make of Stephen Flynn's comments today, saying that a lot of this funding that the Scottish government has is spent making up for the shortcomings of Westminster? I believe was sort of the essence of a speech. What did you think of that, and where do you think that lands with places like with policies like here on energy, and also obviously with two-child cap that you mentioned?
Well, I have to confess, I haven't heard Stephen's speech.
Mm.
I will catch up with that later on. However, from the comments that you've mentioned there, it's a point I've made myself on numerous occasions. I think our colleagues in the Scottish Government have, in some occasions, done far too good a job of mitigating the effects of Westminster rule, and perhaps we don't get the full credit for that that the Scottish Government deserves. So I think that's a pretty fair point to make. There is only so much you can do mitigating what another country is doing elsewhere. And really, what we need is full fiscal autonomy. And the only way we're going to get that is with full independence. So that's the direction of travel. That's what we have to make relevant to everybody in Scotland, so that they understand why we're shouting as loudly as we are for independence, that it is about bread and butter and day-to-day lives. And that's the key point that needs to be made, that you can't just keep mitigating what somebody else is doing. You have to start doing it for yourself, and that's the message that we need to get out there.
That is interesting. And I am wondering actually what sort of sense you have for the future of devolution. I've got a pretty big quote from the King's speech here that I just want to read out and then sort of get your thoughts on. The quote reads, my government will strengthen its work with devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland so that the best outcomes possible are delivered for citizens across the United Kingdom. My ministers will establish a new council of nations and regions to renew opportunities for the Prime Minister, heads of devolved governments, and mayors of combined authorities to collaborate with each other. Now, what is your reaction to to this part of his speech, and what do you think it means for the future of devolution, where at least by views of this council, combined mayors of combined authorities and heads of devolved governments are sort of seen as equal?
I I think the devil's in the detail, so we're going to need to see what the detail actually involves. So I've got two conflicting thoughts from that initial piece of information. The first one is obviously Scotland is a nation, not a region, and we shouldn't be conflated with English regions. And I think that's a fundamental principle that we must not lose sight of. However, on the other hand, anything that breaks the stranglehold of one size fits all policy from London can only be a good thing. So we need to see how it pans out and develops. It may not be all bad, it may not be all good. We will need to wait and see the detail. But I think there's enough there that we should be alarmed about, but there's also opportunity. And it's up to the rest of us to make sure that what comes to pass has more in the way of the opportunity than the negative. So it's one to watch, one we should be very active on, but it might lead to positive outcomes.
Mm. And before we sort of move on, I was wondering, you mentioned the two child cap. Are there other key things that you would have really wanted to be part of the speech? Obviously, it represents the Labour government and not the SNP. But what are some things that you thought were? Is there anything that sticks out to you as like very missing, like something that you would have expected to be there, or something that you just would have really, really hoped, or something that you just think would have been very beneficial for the country that just wasn't there?
I think the big ticket item that's missing is any kind of boost to NHS funding, or an end to the austerity cuts, particularly anything that privatises the NHS. And we need to be really strong on that over the next Parliament, because we have to stop that from happening. If England privatises its NHS, it will cut its level of public funding that it gives, which then in turn cuts the Scottish Government's grants, because, consequentials have consequences, and not particularly good ones when you're looking at an austerity-based agenda. And that, I think, is a big part of the problem, because we know that the Labour government that we now have is sticking with former Tory spending plans, and their fiscal rules. So they're in a very confined straitjacket. They're not going to have flexibility on public spending, and things are going to get cut, and we're going to see the consequences.
Yeah, taking a look at some of these other sort of big topic issues, how do you feel about the lack of there was a lack of any sort of EU announcement? Obviously, Rachel Reeves has said that she wouldn't be interested in being part of the single customs union. What do you make of that, and where do you think that that leaves the country?
I think that whole approach is bonkers. I can understand where it's coming from politically. It doesn't make it any more sensible, and I think the reality is the rightward drift of UK politics, and it's becoming very hostile to any migrants, immigrants, any foreigners. And it's kind of sickening in many ways. The reality is where we are just now is we have a super Labour majority on a fairly fragile share of the vote UK wide, around 34%. The forces of the right, the Tories and Reform, have around 41, 42% share of the vote. And the only way they're going to save seats at the next election, whether that be in 4 or 5 years, is to tack further to the right. And that is completely at odds with Scottish values and our desire to get back into Europe. But we're going to see a lot more of that hostile anti-Europe, anti-foreigner stuff coming, I think, over the next few years. And it's quite depressing as a thought. I would love to be proven wrong, but I think that's the reality of what we're looking at.
Understood. And just as a final note, there were plans for infrastructure mentioned, and also renters' rights. How do you think housing will develop in the UK? Do you trust the Labour government to boost housing building, and also renters' rights? Is this something that you expect out of the coming years?
I hope they do. I think there's a lot of benefit that people in England would get from that. I think they've had a much worse situation in terms of house building than we have here in Scotland, where the Scottish Government's managed to see more houses being built over the last number of years. So I think, yes, that's good to hear. Whether it affects us directly or not, time will tell. But yeah, anything positive there. I think one area that was getting trailed by the media, and I don't know what the detail for the King's speech would be, to do with Labour's plans for transport in England. And if they are reforming them, then there may be some scope for additional powers for Scotland, particularly if the competition and market rules have been waived to allow
Mm.
local authorities to create integrated transport networks. So I think there might be some spin-off benefits that we get there that boost our ability to do things. So let's just wait and see, I think, in a number of these areas.
Thank you, Martin. For our next story, we've got Harland and Wolff awaiting news of a £200 million UK government funding lifeline. Harland and Wolff, the owner of Belfast shipyard that built the Titanic, has insisted that it is still awaiting a government decision on a £200 million intervention, despite signs that Labour is due to reject the financial lifeline. The company is presenting an early test of the Labour government's industrial policy, with 1,500 workers fearful the company is running out of time to secure funding needed to make it ready to build three warships for the Royal Navy. Harland and Wolff was forced to suspend its London-listed shares a fortnight ago, and it has missed two deadlines to file audited accounts, raising questions over its finances and its ability to fulfill a £1.6 billion contract to build the three fleet solid support ships that will carry supplies such as ammunition and food to the Navy's aircraft carriers. The last Conservative government had provisionally agreed to the deal to 100%. The last Conservative government had provisionally agreed a deal to 100% underwrite a £200 million loan by a consortium of lenders to Harland and Wolff to allow it to refinance its debts. On Tuesday, the company said it had reduced its request for the guarantee from 100% to 80%, and that it had presented legal opinions showing that a guarantee would not violate state aid rules. However, the Financial Times reported that Labour had decided that giving the guarantee would be an inappropriate use of government funds. The company has been investing heavily to recruit a workforce of 1,500 across the Belfast site, plus yards of Appledore in Devon, the Meffel and Arnish in Scotland. It plans to split work in the fleet solid support vessels across the yards, while working in a consortium with Spain's state-owned Navantia. Labour has taken Labour has taken power with the future of several other UK industrial sites in the balance, including Belfast Short Brothers factory, which is being sold by the Spirit Aerosystems to Airbus, and the Port Talbot Steelworks in South Wales, where talks between the new government and the owner of Tata Steel over decarbonisation and jobs are ongoing. On Tuesday, Scottish Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes announced £14.2 million of investment in the Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow to improve productivity and build a sustainable future for the Scottish government-owned company.
Yeah, I was trying to look at where Sammy Wilson was coming from. I thought it can't be from any of the tabs I've got open on my machine. And I'm glad it wasn't.
What do you make of the story I read out just here with ship production, and where do you think this disparity between Labour maybe not UK Labour not being as ready to take on these sort of shipbuilding projects, while obviously in Scottish government we just announced some?
I think you've got to get a balance of between saving jobs and supporting key skills, and I don't envy any government in trying to make these decisions, because whatever decisions you make will get absolutely panned and criticised by your critics. So whatever outcome any government makes, they're on a kind of losing role from a PR angle, because there's no right answers. And that in an ideal world, businesses wouldn't be in trouble and wouldn't need financial support. But who do they turn to? And if there are risks there from financial firms, then the last lender or person to back their guarantee probably is the government. And is it significantly strategic enough that you need to support it? If it is, you should. And that requires a degree of political decision making. I have to be honest, I haven't looked at the situation in Northern Ireland well enough to say whether they're making which decision I would make if I was in their shoes. So I don't want to be too critical in criticising, but I think that's the dilemma that people have. You're talking a serious number of jobs, skilled jobs in a very niche area. In my wider view, I think we need to get away from a reliance on Ministry of Defence contracts and get into other forms of shipbuilding in order to preserve and expand jobs. But I'm not an expert in this field, and I'm probably demonstrating that just now by my vague comments.
Thank you, Mr. Day. For our next story, we've got the hopes of August rate cut fall from the UK inflation stays at 2%. The chances of an August interest rate cut have taken a blow after a sharp jump in the hotel prices meant progress in the UK's fight against inflation stalled last month. A nearly 9% a jump in the cost of a hotel room, blamed by some analysts on a Taylor Swift effect, offset the impact of cut price clothing to leave the government's preferred measure of the cost of living at its 2% target for a second month in a row in June. With measures of underlying inflation also holding steady, the city said the prospect of the Bank of England reducing the cost of borrowing from its current level of 5.25% at its next meeting on the 1st of August had diminished. Financial markets trimmed their forecasts for the likelihood of an August cut down from a 50% to a 35% chance on Wednesday after the Office for National Statistics (ONS) released the inflation data. The pound rose above $1.30. Pound rose above being worth $1.30 against the US dollar on the currency markets for the first time in a year amid expectations that rates would remain on hold until September or even November. Martin, is it fair to judge inflation over the price of a hotel room? Does this have much of a meaning, or is this just like a momentary, like the story implied, just a Taylor Swift effect?
It could well be the Taylor Swift effect. The reality, though, is while it's good news that inflation rates are coming down, the cost of everything is still going up. It's just going up at a lower rate. And, people's wages have not kept pace with what they've seen over the last couple of years. We're still feeling the effect of the disastrous 40 odd days of Liz Truss's government, for example. So there's a lot of damage limitation that still needs to be done. People are still feeling the squeeze, and it's slight comfort, but it's not enough. We need to be helping people really with the cost of living in a much greater way. But yeah, I hope that the rates do come down. That is a move in the right direction if they do. However, prices are still a lot higher than they were a few years ago.
Now, taking a look back, obviously, the King's speech didn't mention too much regarding the cost of living. Do you think that this is do you think that this stuff will come later in the Labour term? Do you expect them to?
Well, they've packed quite a lot of potential bits of legislation into the King's speech, so there's no real plan to tackle cost of living. There's no mention of how you tackle rising food prices, which are debilitating for many families and leading to poorer lifestyle choices for what they can afford, which then has a knock-on effect on later health costs down the line. So it's something that desperately does need addressed. I don't know when they'll address it. It may be something they can address in an autumn statement budget, which I presume will be the next big event after Parliament returns in September at some point. So there may be opportunities, but I would have thought if they were planning to do something, they would have been singing it from the rafters in the King's speech and then delivering later on. So its absence causes me concern.
Hmm. For our next story, we have a cell phone and detonator found on rooftop near the suspected Trump shooter. A picture obtained by a Pittsburgh area TV station showed a cell phone and detonator carried by the gunman who attempted to assassinate Donald Trump at the Butler County Showgrounds in Western Pennsylvania last Saturday. The items were shown on the rooftop from which Thomas Matthew Crooks used an AR-15 style rifle to fire on the former president and Republican presidential nominee, Donald Trump. Trump suffered an injury to his right ear. One rally goer was killed and two injured. The 20-year-old gunman was shot dead by security officers. In a febrile and partisan national atmosphere, the shooting appears to have boosted Trump's image in the campaign against Joe Biden. President Biden has called for a cooling of political invective. New word for me. At the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Trump has worn a prominent badge on his ear as speakers have celebrated his narrow escape. The gunman's motives remained unclear, though officials said they had been able to access his phone. Sources told the Washington Post that cracking the phone did not crack the case, though it offered leads to pursue. Crooks's car was found to contain a metal box of explosives connected to a receiver, CNN reported, adding that investigators were considering the idea Crooks intended to create a distraction during the shooting. WPXI also reported on the continuing confusion over why the gunman was not confronted before he fired on Trump. Crooks was seen by witnesses and by law enforcement, but not conclusively confronted. A new AP NORC poll published today had found that nearly two-thirds of Democrats want Joe Biden to withdraw his re-election bid, according to the poll, which was mostly conducted before Donald Trump's assassination attempt on Saturday. 65% of Democrats say that Biden should withdraw. Overall, 7 in 10 American adults say that Biden should drop out from the race. Now, Martin, there's quite a few things to unpack here, quite a lot to
No.
go through. Firstly, I kind of wanted to touch on, in terms of political messaging, how strong of a boost do you think this gives to Trump? Trump is obviously donning this big, oversized like bandage over his ear to sort of demonstrate this event. How much of a rallying call can this be for his base?
It's certainly going to. It's like throwing red meat out to the wolves, isn't it? I mean, it's going to play straight into his supporters' camp. He is the. It's almost like martyrdom, but still being alive. He will milk it for everything it's worth. I've seen some of the Republican supporters' videos on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I had I had to check that they were actually genuine and not spoofs. It certainly turbocharges the febrile nature of that whole continent. Had the shooter been a bit more accurate with his aim, America might even be in a state of a civil war now. I mean, it's so dangerous a melting pot. I hosted a live stream while I was an MP from London. We had a Democratic consultant by the name of John Riley on talking about the different campaigns, and he had an enlightening comment that in any other election, both Trump and Biden are completely unelectable, but one of them's going to win. And I have to say, I think this shooting probably nudges it more likely in the Trump camp, just for the media effect. It plays to his victim card that he's been trying to play, that they're all out to get him. And unfortunately, I think he's one of the most dangerous politicians in the world. We can put him up there beside Putin and Khomeini and Erdogan, and very unstable figure, and not somebody I'd want with their finger on the nuclear button. But there we have it.
Yeah. Do you think that there's still time? Do you think it's viable for Biden to step down now and then race for a new candidate and go through that whole entire media cycle of promoting a new person and stomping any controversy that comes out about him? Is that even, do you see it as a viable option?
I don't even know if it's viable. I think sometimes you just have to roll with the punches and go with the team you have. And I think he does bring some gravitas to the role. He has experience in backers, and the cost of American politics is astronomical. So suddenly changing tack at this point might be a task too much for them. So I think you probably just have to go with it and play up the strengths of the vice president, who, were anything to happen to the president, would then become the next president by default. So perhaps you just have to play your team and play your team as strongly as you can, and hope that it's enough to say that they're saner than Trump and his camp are. And from some of the stuff I've seen on social media, they certainly are saner.
Thank you, Martin. For our next story, we've got £13.77 million invested to support heritage projects across Scotland. The second largest grant giver for heritage in Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland, HES, has published a grants funding report for the first time, showcasing how their grants are spent. The report also aims to uncover trends and aid in future planning for the heritage organisation. HES gives out an average of about £13.5 million each year on behalf of the Scottish Government, supporting projects that protect and promote the country's historic environment. HES spends more money with charities than any other type of organisation, with applicants ranging from well-established organisations to younger development trusts for whom heritage is a new area of operation. The new report illustrates that 74% of the HES grants budget is spent on physical works, ranging from small-scale adaptation to whole refurbishment projects, such as the John O. Groats Mill. For the project, HES has awarded £500,000 to support repairs to the historic fabric of the mill, transforming the site into a new visitor attraction for the area. Thanks to this grant funding, the new attraction will allow visitors to see a working mill, and the local community will benefit from a new event space able to cater to a wide range of activities. The remaining 26% of the HES grants budget goes towards core funding for heritage organizations with a national remit, training and engagement, intangible cultural heritage, and archaeology. HES currently spends considerably more per capita on archaeology than comparable heritage agencies in the rest of the UK, contributing to a very healthy sector where community activities can play a major role in driving the agenda. The Citadel project, run by a University of Aberdeen, is one such activity, focusing on excavation and research-led investigations at the Pictish Elite Centre in Moray. HES has awarded over £400,000, which will help fund the project to positively impact the historic environment through sustainably managing the coastal erosion threats in the area and maximize archaeological research opportunities. Monitoring key terms in the grant applications received, the report notes that 62% of applications in the last year referenced climate change, showing increased awareness with the sector of this as a driver for action. The report also provides information on the COVID Recovery Fund, established by HES in 2020, through which 41 projects with urgent requirements as a result of a pandemic were funded. Martyn, talk to me about the strengths of archaeology for the country. What does it provide for these communities?
Well, I'm a bit out of date in terms of archaeology, but and that's not meant to be a pun or a joke, but it is important because it's part of our history and our heritage. So we've got to get it right, preserve it, record it, and make sure that we learn from it, and it's there as a tourism boost for future generations as well. So there's a lot of positives, and for a lot of communities, it's a key string in their arsenal for attracting visitors and keeping their own societies vibrant. So all of that's really positive, and in the grand scheme of things, it's a decent amount of money, but it's a fairly small amount of money when you compare it to the costs of many other things. So if we can do some good with that, then all for the best.
Thank you very much, Martyn, and it was great having you. And this does actually wrap us up for the evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but our income is just over £2,000 a month, and we are now facing mounting debts. Please donate whatever you can afford. Thanks again to Martyn Dayl, the former SNP MP for Falkirk, from Linlithgow and East Falkirk. That was it. I'm so sorry. It was great having you. Thank you very much for your insight.
No problem.
And goodbye. Thank you for watching.
Ruth Davidson has been absolutely cowardly on this. She said, oh, the Scottish Government should just mitigate it. Mitigate it! Mitigate it! If she thinks it's worth mitigating, she should get on the phone to Theresa May. She should get on the phone to her and say, scrap the two-child policy, scrap the rate clause and do it now.